Imagine walking through the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where the air itself could kill you, where a simple cough meant death, where children's laughter was silenced by diseases that turned their skin black, and where even the wealthy couldn't escape the invisible killers lurking in every shadow. What if I told you that the very doctors meant to save lives were actually making things worse? Today we're uncovering the heartbreaking, unbelievable, and sometimes truly unsettling stories of the 10 deadliest diseases that terrorized the Victorian era. These weren't just illnesses, they were death sentences wrapped in mystery, turning entire families into graveyards and bringing even the mightiest empire to its knees. From the disease that painted London's Thames River with corpses to the illness that drove people to madness before stealing their final breath. By the time we reach number 1, you'll understand why Victorians lived in constant fear of the next epidemic. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, was a time of incredible progress: steam engines, electricity, and industrial revolution. Yet beneath this veneer of advancement lurked a medical nightmare. Victorian doctors, armed with little more than bloodletting, mercury treatments, and sheer determination, faced diseases that killed faster than they could understand them. This was an age where germ theory was still controversial, where surgeons operated without washing their hands, and where the cure was often deadlier than the disease itself. Number 10. Diphtheria, the strangling angel of children. Starting off at number 10, we have diphtheria, a disease so feared that Victorians called it the strangling angel of children. This bacterial infection didn't just kill, it tortured its victims slowly, creating a thick, leather-like membrane that grew across the throat like a living noose. In Victorian England, diphtheria swept through nurseries and schools like wildfire. Children would wake up with what seemed like a simple sore throat, but within hours their breathing would become labored, their voice would turn to a harsh whisper, and their neck would swell grotesquely. The disease earned its terrifying nickname because it literally strangled children from the inside, as the toxic membrane blocked their airways completely. What made diphtheria particularly horrifying was how it targeted the innocent. While adults might recover, children between the ages of 2 and 10 faced mortality rates of up to 60%. Victorian doctors could only watch helplessly as entire families lost child after child to this merciless killer. The disease didn't claim the children of both paupers and princes with equal cruelty. The treatments available were barbaric, and often fatal themselves. Doctors would attempt to cut the membrane from the throat with unsterilized instruments, often causing fatal hemorrhaging. Others tried to force tubes down swollen throats, frequently puncturing vital organs in the process. The cure, quite literally, was often worse than the disease. But diphtheria was just the beginning of our descent into Victorian medical hell. Number 9. Erysipelas, the fire that consumed from within. At number 9, we encounter Erysipelas, known to terrified Victorians as St. Anthony's fire or the rose. This streptococcal infection didn't just affect the skin, it transformed its victims into living embodiments of agony, their flesh turning bright red and swelling until they resembled walking burns. The disease typically began as a small cut or scratch, seemingly harmless, but within hours, the infection would spread like wildfire under the skin, creating raised, burning red patches that felt like molten metal to the touch. Victims described the sensation as being cooked alive from the inside out, their skin becoming so hot that they couldn't bear even the lightest touch of clothing. Victorian medical journals document cases where the infection spread so rapidly that patients went from healthy to dead within 48 hours. The disease had a particular cruelty: it often targeted the face, causing such severe swelling that victims became unrecognizable to their own families. Their features would distort into grotesque masks of inflamed flesh, eyes swollen shut, lips so enlarged they couldn't speak their final words. What made Erysipelas especially terrifying was its unpredictability. It could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time: a housewife cutting vegetables, a child with a scraped knee, a gentleman with a shaving nickel could become victims of this burning plague. Victorian doctors tried everything from mercury poisoning to deliberate bloodletting, but these treatments often accelerated the patient's death rather than preventing it. The psychological impact was devastating, as survivors often bore permanent scars that marked them as having survived the fire, creating a stigma that lasted lifetimes. Number 8. Consumption, the romantic killer. Coming in at number 8, we have consumption, now known as tuberculosis, the disease that killed more Victorians than any other single cause. But this wasn't just a disease, it was a slow, beautiful death that the Victorians both feared and romanticized in equal measure. Consumption earned its name because it literally consumed its victims from within, slowly eating away at their lungs, their strength, and their hope. The disease had a cruel artistry to it. Victims would develop a ghostly pallor, their eyes would grow bright and feverish, and many would experience a final, deceptive burst of energy and beauty just before death claimed them. The statistics are staggering. In Victorian London, 1 in 4 deaths was caused by consumption. Entire families would be wiped out as the disease passed from person to person through the air they breathed. The wealthy fled to sanitariums in Switzerland, while the poor died in overcrowded tenements where the infection spread like wildfire through the shared, stagnant air. What made consumption particularly insidious was its long, drawn-out progression. Victims could suffer for months or even years, slowly wasting away as their lungs filled with blood and infection. They would cough up increasing amounts of blood, their voices would become hoarse whispers, and their bodies would waste away until they resembled walking skeletons. Victorian doctors prescribed everything from fresh air to arsenic, from bloodletting to drinking the blood of freshly slaughtered animals. Some recommended travel to exotic locations, leading to the tragic phenomenon of consumption tourism, where dying patients spent their final months in foreign lands, alone and desperate. The disease didn't just kill, it destroyed entire family lines and created a culture of fear around the simple act of breathing. The psychological impact was devastating, as survivors often bore permanent scars that marked them as having survived the fire, creating a stigma that lasted lifetimes. Number 7. Puerperal fever, the curse of new mothers. At number 7, we encounter puerperal fever, the disease that turned the miracle of childbirth into a death sentence. This bacterial infection, now known as postpartum sepsis, killed more new mothers than any other cause, transforming what should have been joyous occasions into funeral preparations. The disease was particularly cruel because it struck women at their most vulnerable moment just after giving birth. Within hours of delivery, new mothers would develop a fever, their bodies would begin to shake uncontrollably, and their wounds would become infected with a putrid, foul-smelling discharge that signaled the beginning of their end. What made fever especially horrifying was its sudden onset and rapid progression. A woman could give birth successfully, hold her newborn child, and be dead within 3 days. The infection would spread through her bloodstream, causing her abdomen to swell with gas and infection, her skin to turn yellow, and her mind to become delirious with fever. Victorian hospitals were death traps for new mothers. In some maternity wards, the mortality rate from puerperal fever reached 30%. Nearly 1 in 3 women died. The disease was so common that many women wrote their wills before going into labor, treating childbirth as a potential death sentence, rather than a celebration of life. The most tragic aspect was that Victorian doctors unknowingly spread the disease themselves. They would go directly from autopsies to deliveries without washing their hands, carrying the infection from corpse to new mother. When Dr. Ignace Semelois suggested that doctors washed their hands with chlorinated lime, he was ridiculed and ostracized. By the medical establishment, the disease left countless newborns motherless and husbands widowed, creating a generation of children who would never know their mother's embrace. Number 6. Typhoid fever, the poor man's plague. At number 6, we delve into typhoid fever, the disease that thrived in Victorian squalor and turned the basic human need for water into a game of Russian roulette. This bacterial infection didn't just kill, it revealed the shocking inequality of Victorian society, where the poor died in agony while the wealthy remained largely untouched. Typhoid fever was spread through contaminated water and food, making it the perfect disease for Victorian cities where human waste flowed freely through the streets and into the water supply. The infection would begin innocuously, enough a headache, some stomach discomfort, but within days, victims would develop the characteristic rose-colored spots on their chest. Their fever would spike to life-threatening levels, and their minds would slip into delirium. What made typhoid particularly terrifying was its method of transmission. Every sip of water, every bite of food, every breath of air in the crowded slums could carry death. The disease had a perverse democracy. It could strike anyone who came into contact with contaminated water, regardless of age or social status. Though the poor suffered disproportionately. Victorian medical records describe the horrifying progression of the disease. Victims would develop a sustained fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. Their abdomens would become distended with gas, and they would suffer from violent diarrhea that would leave them dehydrated and weakened. In severe cases, the infection would cause intestinal bleeding and perforation, leading to a slow, agonizing death. The disease's most famous victim was Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's beloved husband, whose death from typhoid in 1861 plunged the entire nation into mourning. His death proved that even royalty wasn't safe from the diseases that plagued the common people, but typhoid's true horror lay in its ability to create carriers, people who showed no symptoms but could spread the disease to others for decades, unknowingly becoming angels of death in their communities. Number 5. Asiatic cholera, the Blue Death. Coming in at number 5, we encounter Asiatic cholera, the disease that literally turned people blue as they died. This bacterial infection didn't just kill, it transformed its victims into grotesque caricatures of human beings, their skin turning a deep blue-black color as their bodies rapidly dehydrated from violent, unstoppable diarrhea. Cholera struck Victorian Britain in waves, each pandemic bringing unprecedented death and terror. The disease was merciless in its speed. Healthy people could be dead within hours of showing their first symptoms. The infection would begin with mild stomach discomfort, but within hours, victims would be racked with violent vomiting and diarrhea that would drain their bodies of all fluids. What made cholera particularly horrifying was its visible transformation of the human form. As victims lost massive amounts of fluid, their skin would become cold and clammy, their eyes would sink deep into their skulls, and their extremities would turn blue from lack of circulation. They would develop what doctors called washerwoman's hands, wrinkled, prune-like fingers that looked like they had been soaked in water for days. The disease had a particular cruelty in its final stages. Victims would remain conscious almost until the very end, trapped in bodies that were literally dying of thirst despite their desperate attempts to drink. Their voices would become hoarse whispers, their pulse would become thread-like, and their bodies would cramp with excruciating muscle spasms. Victorian London's first cholera pandemic in 1832 killed over 6,000 people in just a few months. The disease struck hardest in the overcrowded slums, where people lived in conditions that would horrify modern observers. Entire families would be wiped out in a matter of days, leaving behind only empty homes and the lingering smell of death. The panic was so intense that healthy people would flee the cities, abandoning their sick relatives and friends. The disease exposed the worst of human nature, as fear drove people to abandon basic compassion and human decency. Number 4. Scarlet fever, the crimson killer of children. At number 4, we encounter scarlet fever, the disease that painted its victims in shades of death and targeted children with particular vengeance. This streptococcal infection didn't just kill, it marked its victims with a distinctive crimson rash that served as a visible countdown to death. Scarlet fever was particularly cruel because it often began like a common cold. Children would develop a sore throat and fever symptoms that worried parents dismissed as minor illnesses. But within 24 hours, the characteristic rash would appear, a bright red flush that spread across the body like spilled blood, giving the skin a rough, sandpaper-like texture. What made scarlet fever especially terrifying was its rapid progression and high mortality rate among children. The infection would cause the throat to swell severely, making swallowing and breathing difficult. The tongue would become bright red and swollen, creating what doctors called strawberry tongue. As the disease progressed, victims would develop high fevers that could cause permanent brain damage or death. Victorian records show that scarlet fever epidemics could devastate entire communities. In some outbreaks, the mortality rate among children under 10 reached 30%. Schools would close, parents would keep their children indoors, and entire neighborhoods would fall silent as families mourned their lost children. The disease had a particular cruelty in its complications. Even children who survived the initial infection faced potential long-term consequences, including kidney damage, heart problems, and arthritis. Some would develop what doctors called scarlet fever madness, a form of delirium that could last for weeks or months. Victorian doctors tried numerous treatments, including bloodletting, mercury compounds, and even deliberate exposure to smallpox, in the mistaken belief that one disease could cure another. These treatments often killed more children than the disease itself. The psychological impact on Victorian society was profound, as parents lived in constant fear during epidemic seasons, knowing that their children could be claimed by the Crimson Killer at any moment. Number 3. Smallpox, the speckled monster. At number 3, we face smallpox, the disease that Victorian doctors called the speckled monster for its ability to transform human beings into barely recognizable masses of infected flesh. This viral infection didn't just kill, it disfigured its victims so severely that survivors often wished they had died instead. Smallpox was perhaps the most visually horrifying disease of the Victorian era. The infection would begin with flu-like symptoms, but within days, victims would develop the characteristic pustules that covered their entire body. These weren't just spots, they were deep, painful lesions filled with pus that would merge together, creating sheets of infected tissue that would eventually scab over and fall off. What made smallpox particularly terrifying was its method of disfigurement. The pustules would appear everywhere, on the face, inside the mouth, on the genitals, even on the soles of the feet. Victims would become so swollen and disfigured that they were unrecognizable to their own families. The pain was excruciating, as every movement would cause the pustules to rupture and bleed. Victorian medical records describe the horror of smallpox wards, where patients lay moaning in agony, their bodies covered in what one doctor described as a living carpet of infection. The smell was so overwhelming that even experienced medical staff would vomit when entering the wards. The disease's mortality rate varied, but in severe cases it could kill up to 30% of its victims. Those who survived faced a lifetime of disfigurement, with deep scars and pockmarks that marked them as smallpox survivors. Many were left blind, as the infection would destroy the corneas of their eyes. What made smallpox especially cruel was its targeting of children and young adults. The disease would sweep through schools and orphanages, leaving behind a generation of scarred survivors, who would bear its marks for life. The psychological impact was devastating. Smallpox survivors faced social ostracism and discrimination, as their scars were seen as marks of shame and contagion. Many became recluses, hiding their disfigured faces from a world that found them repulsive. Number 2, rabies, the madness that killed. At number 2, we confront rabies. The disease that didn't just kill, it drove its victims to madness first, creating a terrifying spectacle that traumatized entire communities. This viral infection transformed rational human beings into rabid, violent creatures who would attack their own loved ones in fits of uncontrollable rage. Rabies was particularly insidious because its symptoms could appear weeks or even months after the initial bite. Victims would begin to experience subtle changes, anxiety, confusion, slight behavioral changes that their families might dismiss as stress or illness. But as the virus spread through their nervous system, these mild symptoms would escalate into full-blown madness. What made rabies absolutely terrifying was its effect on the mind. Victims would develop an intense fear of water, known as hydrophobia, that would cause them to go into violent convulsions at the sight or sound of liquid. They would foam at the mouth, their voices would become hoarse and animalistic, and they would lash out at anyone who came near them. Victorian accounts describe the horror of watching loved ones succumb to rabies madness. Gentle mothers would become violent, trying to bite their own children. Respected gentlemen would crawl on all fours, barking like dogs and snapping at anyone who approached. The transformation was so complete that families would often flee their homes, abandoning their infected relatives to die alone. The disease's progression was relentless and always fatal. Once symptoms appeared, death was inevitable, usually within days. Victims would alternate between periods of violent agitation and exhausted calm, their minds gradually deteriorating until they lost all semblance of humanity. Victorian doctors had no treatment for rabies. They could only restrain victims and wait for death to claim them. Some doctors recommended immediate cauterization of bite wounds with red-hot irons, but this barbaric treatment was often ineffective and caused additional suffering. The fear of rabies was so intense that suspected victims were sometimes killed to prevent them from spreading the disease to others. The mere suspicion of rabies could turn a community against its own members, creating a climate of paranoia and violence. Number 1, the Great Stink Disease, cholera's deadly cousin. At number 1, we reach the most terrifying disease of the Victorian era, not just cholera, but the entire family of waterborne diseases that turned London's Thames into a river of death. During the Great Stink of 1858, this wasn't just one disease, it was a cocktail of death that included cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and other intestinal infections that transformed the very air of London into a toxic miasma. The Great Stink was caused by an unusually hot summer that turned the Thames into an open sewer. The river, which served as both London's water source and its waste disposal system, became so polluted that members of Parliament couldn't meet because the stench was overwhelming. But the smell was just the beginning. The real horror was the invisible army of diseases that thrived in this toxic environment. What made this the ultimate Victorian medical nightmare was its scale and indiscriminate nature. The contaminated water supply meant that every person in London was potentially at risk, regardless of social class or wealth. The diseases spread through the air, through food, through water, and through human contact. creating a perfect storm of death that brought the greatest city in the world to its knees. The symptoms were a hellish combination of all the diseases we've discussed. Victims would experience violent vomiting and diarrhea, high fevers, delirium, and painful cramping. Their skin would turn blue from dehydration. They would develop the characteristic rose spots of typhoid, and their bodies would waste away as multiple infections attacked their organs simultaneously. Victorian medical records from 1858 describe scenes that sound like something from a nightmare. Entire families would die within days of each other, their bodies piled in overcrowded morgues. The death toll was so high that graves couldn't be dug fast enough, and bodies were left stacked in the streets. The smell of death mixed with the great stink to create an atmosphere of pure horror. What made this the most terrifying disease of the Victorian era was its revelation of how helpless even the most advanced civilization could be against microscopic enemies. The British Empire, which ruled a quarter of the world, was brought to its knees by bacteria it couldn't see, understand, or fight. The psychological impact was devastating. Londoners lived in constant fear, not knowing if their next meal, their next drink of water, or their next breath would be their last. The disease exposed the shocking inequality of Victorian society, where the poor died in agony while the wealthy fled to their country estates. Conclusion: from the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London to the grand estates of the countryside, from the industrial cities of the north to the rural villages of the south, disease didn't discriminate. These 10 killers remind us that behind the veneer of progress and prosperity, the Victorian era was a time of medical darkness where microscopic enemies could bring even the mightiest empire to its knees. The lives lost to these diseases weren't just statistics, they were mothers who never saw their children grow up, children who never had the chance to live their dreams, and entire families erased from history by invisible killers. Their stories remind us how far we've come, but also how fragile life can be when we're faced with enemies we can't see, can't understand, and can't fight. These diseases shaped not just individual lives, but entire societies, creating a culture of fear and death that defined an era. They remind us that progress isn't just about steam engines and electricity. It's about conquering the invisible enemies that lurk in the shadows, waiting to claim their next victim. What disease from this list terrified you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more dark chapters from history's most terrifying medical nightmares.